Today we are going to play with some watercolors. So this is a collage that I did with some students last year, and you can see all of these cool different watercolor techniques. So I basically had them make their own papers, which I'm going to show you how to do today. And then we just collaged it out. I used flowers as an example. If you see a theme, I use flowers a lot because I feel like it's an unintimidating sort of thing for kids to draw, and nobody's flower is going to look wrong, right? So it gives them the freedom to create different flower patterns, different shapes, or if they wanted to do a different image, I let them do a different image. They could cut out whatever they wanted to. I do always like to have some sort of a visual for the kids that need a jumping off place. So if they don't have an idea of their own, they can do something similar to this. Or the kids who have big imaginations and just need a place to let that go, they can do whatever they want. So this one, same kind of idea. We're going to learn different watercolor techniques. I'm not sure how much that's picking up in the light, but so here we did salt and then the plastic wrap and the wet on wet. I'm going to show you guys all that, but I did it in a little bit of a different format. So you can see this is a larger piece of paper, and the first thing we did was to, in pencil, divide the paper into 4 sections and then create some large image in the middle that the kids had the option to fill in whatever way they wanted to. They could use watercolor when all was said and done, or they could use marker, whatever they wanted. But in each section, we used the different watercolor techniques. So let's jump into that and I'll show you how to do it. Basically what you're going to need for this is obviously a cup of water for the watercolor. I would do a pretty medium-sized brush, nothing too small because we want to get the papers completely covered. A watercolor palette. Palettes are going to be the easiest things to use when it comes to kiddos. Some table salt, a plastic bag, and plastic wrap. So for the paper, I think you definitely want to use watercolor paper. I just took this paper, cut it in half because we don't need a whole huge sheet of paper for each type of technique. And then let the kids have, and then they'll have 4 different pieces of paper ultimately that they can play with the different textures with. So especially if you're doing groups of kids, this is just kind of a nice way to be conservative with materials, because watercolor paper, good watercolor paper especially, not necessarily the cheapest thing. So once you have the papers cut in half, I would have each child write their name on the back of the paper here somewhere. And then also each technique, and then just step by step. We're doing plastic wrap on this, plastic bag, etc., with their name on it, so that when you're setting all of this aside to dry, then they don't get mixed up. So let me show you what we're doing with this plastic bag. So one plastic bag can go a long way. I've already cut the handles off, and then I thought maybe I should show you guys how I cut the plastic bag to make life easier for everyone. So then I'm going to take the end that's closed and I'm just going to cut it down on the edge just to get rid of that. And then we're going to take the sides and cut along the sides. Voila. So now you have this nice big sheet of crinkly plastic. Let me advertise for Domino's. All right, and now you can cut it down to about the size of your papers, because you're not going to need it to be bigger than that. It doesn't have to be perfect. Don't worry about all of these little edges. Just cut it down to basically about the size that you'll need for one of your pieces of paper. And then each kid, if you're doing this in a group, would get 1 sheet of this paper. When you're handing out supplies to groups of kiddos, I think it's very important not to hand out all the supplies at once. I would just say, oh, let me find the right one. Label all your papers, names on all the papers, and then say, okay, take your plastic bag sheet and put that one in front of you, words down, and here's your plastic bag piece, okay? And the same thing with the rest of the materials. Otherwise, their little hands are just going to be tempted to play, and it could be very chaotic. All right, so let's get started in these different techniques. So for the plastic bag, what we're going to do is just let the kids paint the paper. And this is actually this is just a legitimate technique if you like to do collage as well, to create some interesting textures. for your collage pieces or your own artwork as well. So we're just gonna cover the paper. I encourage lots of color just to make it interesting. This is a great way to start getting out of the box and thinking about how things, how to make things look like something else, and instead just be able to enjoy the materials, experiment with the materials, and see what they do. And then once you know how to work your materials, then you can get more into some of the technical things. Again, as I mentioned in some of my other videos that I've done for the kids series here, this is a great time too with the watercolor for kids to start seeing how colors mix. Whoops, I mixed it in my palette by accident. The brush is so big for this little palette. Oopsie. So they can see, you know, for example, when they get some of that red into the yellow, how it makes a darker color, or depending on the red that they use, an orange. So this is a great experiment in color mixing as well. This tiny little palette and this big brush. And I will also link below, as I have done in the other videos, the supplies that we used a lot at the nonprofit that I worked for. So if you're using watercolor, it's a great idea to give each kid their own watercolor palette, because then they tend to take a little more care in not mixing the colors into the palette, or in the palette rather, because if they have to use the same palette over and over again and they don't want their colors to be mucky and yucky, then they will kind of make sure they don't do that if they have their own. All right, so one thing is you do want to make sure that there's a good bit of water on the paper still. We don't need it to be too soggy, but just let them get that paper covered, and then easy peasy, you just take that plastic bag and pat it on top. The important thing is not to move it around. We're just letting it drop on top and then push and lift. And then we're gonna leave it there, and it's super important to let them know once you have the plastic on there, just do not take it off, right? And we're gonna leave that on there until it dries. So for the plastic wrap, we're doing basically the same thing. We're going to cover our paper in lots of color, and then we're going to put the plastic wrap on top. So with the plastic wrap, it might be a little bit trickier as far as handing the materials out all at once, because as you can see, I'm struggling to even get it out of the box. I swear this stuff is the bane of my existence. So like handing it out, and then if you give it to the kids, like what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a lot of this action happening while they have it at their tables. It can be very frustrating. So with this one, first of all, I recommend scissors, because these doodads are not good for much other than me cutting my clumsy self. So I would just go in front of each kid, have them maybe hold one end of it, and then while they're holding it, you cut what they need off of it. And then same thing, they're just going to press the lay the plastic wrap over their paper and press it down. And it is interesting, again, we're not going to rub. We're just going to lift and pat and press it down, and then set it aside to let it dry. And it is actually interesting. You get a little bit of a different texture and effect from the plastic wrap than you do the plastic bag. So the grand reveal is where the kids have a ton of fun. That's always the best. All right, so salt is next. Table salt is next. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to cover our paper in paint, and then we're going to sprinkle it with salt. So definitely making sure there's clean water in between. I just had to clean my water so that the colors don't start getting muddy, because that can be very frustrating. And then we're just going to go in and paint. And this is why the larger brushes are also great, because you do want the kids being able to cover the surface pretty quickly. If they have a teeny tiny brush and they're you know, doing this number all over the paper, then it's going to take forever for them to get the paper covered. But we do want the brush to be small enough that they can actually play with mixing some different colors and experiment around with that. Now, if you have a couple of kids who really do take their time, there's nothing wrong with that. You could always just get a spray bottle and spray the paper before you use the plastic wrap or whatever technique that you're doing, so that their colors don't get mixed up by adding more water with the brush. So for the salt, what I do with this usually when I'm doing this with groups is I find some small bowls and I will put a little bit of salt in bowls, and I tell the kids just take a pinch, okay, lift it up and pinch it from as high up as you can. So they can just have little community bowls of salt, but just let the salt, sprinkle the salt as much or as little as they want. And then just like the other, we're going to set that aside and let it dry. You'll notice how much this paper is curling up. It'll be okay. So far, what we've done with the other three papers is to use what's called wet on dry technique, which is a wet brush with the paint on dry paper. Well, now we're going to do wet on wet, or wet brush on wet paper technique. So to begin with, what we're going to do is take a little bit of water on our brush and brush water on the paper. So what I suggest is that, especially with younger kids, but even the older kids who don't have a lot of experience, is to maybe do half of your small paper first, because the water will want to dry, and then they'll get frustrated and they'll just keep adding more water, and then ultimately they just have kind of a soggy mess, and as the paper curls, it becomes frustrating. So just a little bit of water on one half of the paper first, and then you can see I have a lot of water already in some of these tiny little bits. So then we're going to take wet brush, wet paint, and put it on the paper and get you a little closer. So when we do that, it creates this really beautiful bloom effect, right? So they can go in and they can add the paint and let it bloom, and they can see how it wants to mix that way. We go in with a little bit of a blue, and then as the paint sort of spreads out amongst itself and does its thing, and you see how the colors are mixing because I still had some blue on my brush. So this is a really fun experiment. This is always a big hit. So they can continue to sort of dot and bloom on one side. Clean my brush off a bit and just fill the spaces that way. And you get sort of that alcohol ink vibe of suddenly the paint just has a mind of its own and does what it wants, which I personally love and enjoy. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. And just let them experiment with that and see how things want to mix and melt together. And then, of course, with a clean brush, I might need to change my water because I have such a tiny little container. We're going to go in on the other side and just make sure the other side is covered. And of course, that's going to happen a little bit. That's okay too. And then we're going to paint the other side. So with the other side, maybe play around with creating brush strokes instead of simply dotting, and see how that wants to bloom out and how the colors sort of feather around each other. This is one of my favorites, honestly. I like all of them, but I love this, the softness of this. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, you can kind of see it up here in the corner already, we will end up starting to get some grays. So that's just kind of another lesson of color mixing and art, right? So make sure you kind of discuss that a little bit as well when we're talking about color. And this one is going to be the one that they work the least for that reason. So I would suggest saying, once you get a color down, leave it alone. Don't mess with it anymore, because otherwise you could, the more you work it, this is where less is more. The more you work it, the more those colors are going to mix together. You're going to end up with some kind of a weird grayish, brownish blech, right? So we're going to set this aside, let all of these dry, and I'll show you the end results. Just sort of an added little note that I thought I would mention is that I always have all of these old towels that I keep. Like these are, I have a bunch of these. Like this is an old washcloth. I have lots of old hand towels. Like when they start getting a little too ratty for me to use, you know, in my kitchen, I keep them for art towels. You can see all the love and creativity that has been poured into just this one. So this is what I would take with me into my classroom as well. I left a ton of them there when I left. And so when you're doing projects like this, it's not a terrible idea if you have a, you know, especially a large classroom. If you have the drying racks, you can see how much the paper curls, how much it wants to drip. The stuff's going to drip on top of other people's artwork. We don't want that. So having a separate table somewhere, or even having, if you have these smaller pieces and the kids have enough space in front of them, you could lay out towels in front of them. Let me make this a little bigger. Right, they could each have a towel in front of them, and they could set their pieces on their towels in front of them to dry, take a small break, and when you come back, because this watercolor is not going to take too long to dry, especially when it's ridiculously hot as it is right now in the summertime, and just let them dry there. So that way, one, you don't have to worry about artwork getting mixed up or other people dripping things, spilling things on someone else's artwork, and it's all contained, and you don't have to worry about cleaning up mess afterwards, which the mess afterwards is not that big of a deal. But if you have, like, say, you can see if I can get it, well, it's not going to want to drip now, but you can see where it's dripping. If it drips on the table and bleeds into one of their other pieces, that can become really frustrating. So a pretty good indicator of when these are dry is when the plastic starts wanting to peel off on its own, like it is here. Again, it doesn't take too long. I think this was maybe 15 minutes up here in my very toasty room. So let's take the plastic bag off, and you're just gonna peel it off. And ooh la la, look at all that cool veiny texture. I love that so much. So let's compare that to the plastic wrap. And just, again, it's going to kind of want to come off on its own. If it's sticking, that means it's not quite baked yet. You want to leave it just a little while longer. So you can see that has those pretty lines too, creates those little divisions, but not quite as many. The plastic wrap tends to hold a little more bubbles in it, so you get these larger, smoother effects, and you get the texture of the paper coming through where the plastic touches. So that's those two. Now with the salt, we're going to do with the salt, you can see where the salt pushes the paint away as it dries. And we're just going to take the salt, and over a trash can preferably, we're going to just gently brush the salt off of the paper. A lot of it will just shake off or fall off on its own. And then you're left with these cool sort of sparkly effects that happen with the salt. So you see that very starry effect. This is a nice technique to use if you're trying to create stars or little shimmery areas around something. And then of course here is the dry wet on wet technique, and you can see how that even after we left it, it continued to bloom out. The colors blended. It just creates this beautiful sort of ethereal effect with that. So now, with that said, or with that done rather, this is where, you know, you get the kids to think about how they want to cut their shapes out, what they want to create with all of these beautiful papers that they just made themselves. So with this one, you'll see we just cut the basic shapes out first and then drew the flowers into it. I did that with 3rd through 5th graders. So with the younger kids, you could just let them cut the flower shapes out, cut the petal shapes out. Right, this would be a great project to do, like an Eric Carle project with, creating the papers or just doing shapes. You could just do random shapes as well. And then with this one, of course, they would just put each, after they paint it, they would place the plastic over top of that particular section. This was something I created for a camp for younger kids, so like 1st through 3rd grade, I think it was. So some great ideas. I hope you guys love that. Honestly, these are beautiful techniques to use for your own artwork if you're an artist. So like I said, if you do any kind of collage work, or even just fun techniques to experiment around with if you're learning watercolor for the first time. So I hope you guys love that. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next, what your kids are doing and interested in, if they're enjoying some of these videos, and I will post another one very soon. Hope you guys have a great day. Go forth, create, be crafty, and enjoy.